I'd like to call the meeting of the Senate Finance Committee to order. I'd like to ask the clerk to call the roll.
You have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to start by introducing the clerk staff and the pages, and then I'd like to turn it over to April for presentation. So if you all don't mind, if you would please stand or however you choose and introduce yourselves, I would appreciate it. Can we start with our attorney?
Madam Chair, Stephen Kinderman with Legislative Services.
I'm Jillian Conway with the Senate Clerk's Office.
Alexander Chapman with the Senate Clerk's Office.
Pages?
Good morning. My name is Tavesha Patel from Chester.
Good morning. I'm Margaret Bartos from Fairfax County.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to, where? Yes. Now I'd like to turn it over to our very capable staff, Executive Director, April Keys.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We are going to do the overview of the budget on PowerPoint this morning, and we'll stop after every section to pause for questions, though we are happy for members to go to the chair to take questions at any time as well. So, all right. First, the proposed budget, just a reminder for everybody that there are two budgets. There's the caboose bill, which is the current fiscal year, and that's Senate Bill 29. It's by the time it goes into effect when it's signed by the governor, it's really only for the last couple of months by the time it gets signed of the current fiscal year. When you see the budget amendments that came in, there's not that many because there's not the ability to really make that many changes in that one. Senate Bill 30 is the new biennial budget that will be for fiscal years 25 and 26 and becomes effective on July 1. So I wanted to start with just some key themes for you. You might remember since we did the budget in September that there was $2.4 billion that was going to carry forward in one-time resources that were available for appropriation in this coming biennium. There's additionally one large increase that I want to mention of one-time money is they're proposing to transfer $805 million from the Revenue Reserve Fund. You might remember of the two reserves, the rainy day is constitutional. The Revenue Reserve is a little more flexible. It's in statute. Essentially, they're proposing to dump $805 million out of that fund and to use in the budget. Now, they can do that because the cap between the two funds is at 15%. The previous budget allowed that to be at 20%. They're proposing to go ahead and put that into spend in the budget. And you might remember we talked about that and at the annual meeting, and that might be a little concerning because when you're not in a recession, you're using the one-time funds. But I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Additionally, there are a lot of other one-time sources to pay for ongoing spending, like the literary fund to pay for teacher retirement costs. You might remember at the annual meeting, I said that I thought the revenue for the next biennium was going to be spent majority on Medicaid and K-12 rebenchmarking, and that's the case. And as you see as staff goes through their presentation, you're going to see the majority of that is really in Medicaid. K-12 rebenchmarking is going to look a little less than what we said because there was money that we put in September, or you put in September, that sort of carried forward in rebenchmarking to help with those costs, and then there's some savings related to enrollment and LCI and some other things. So all in all, the budget proposes net spending increase of about $4 billion. That's about $3 of that is in operating and a little less than $1 billion in capital. The thing to keep in mind, and the thing that was discussed at the annual meeting too, is you're going to have to really think about structural balance going forward to avoid building on the imbalance that already currently exists between sort of one-time sources and ongoing spending. That being said, the way the budget came over, it is going to be difficult to unwind a number of things. And so we'll be talking about that as you develop the budget, but it's not going to be probably an easy budget to put together compared to normal. Here on this next slide, you're going to see some of the second year of the proposed biennial budget. You're going to see spending is actually less than or only slightly above 2024 appropriations. And we're just going to point that out to the fact that, again, you'll see if you look under HHR, $1 billion there, that's really Medicaid is the lion's share there, and some of the other smaller forecasts in HHR. But the point being is, in a number of areas, there's actually less money than even the current biennium. And some of the ones even where you see an increase, like in finance, for example, that's mostly debt service. So that's sort of masking that there's other reductions in the budget as it came over in some of the secretarial areas. Senate Bill 30 also includes significant one-time revenue sources, as I mentioned, and then proposes funding in several items in the first year only. And the reason I'm going to mention this is, again, on the structural balance issue. When you're thinking about adopting this next biennial budget, you have to think about, am I leaving no spending in the second year, which creates a hole in the following biennium, because it's that second year that you use to build your base budget for the following biennium. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in the interest of time today, but I'll point out one of the biggest ones. In capital, you'll see central maintenance reserve. That's usually about $200 million per year, and that's for institutions of higher education agencies. It's money to spend on maintaining the existing things that they have. All that money is in the first year, so that leaves a hole in the biennial budget in the second year. And like I said, there's some other things that I won't cover, but it's just something for you to note as we build the budget that makes it a little more difficult as you think about where you want to be. Slide 8 is some major operating spendings items. I'm not going to spend tons of time here because the analysts are going to go through it. There again, you see Medicaid utilization inflation, and that includes backfilling the health care fund where tobacco tax revenues and other things are down, and that usually pays for a portion of Medicaid. You'll see there's several K-12 things. Here, there's the disability waiver slots you might have heard of. There's one-time money for state agency funding, a discretionary water quality improvement fund deposit. That's based on a statute that was passed, though, recently. Then there's some salary actions for teachers, reducing unfunded liabilities in the teacher plan, and then some other items. And these are just the ones that were 100. So again, the analysts are above, and the analysts are going to cover some more items. Here you see some of the major savings items. Here you see the literary fund is being used to support school employee retirement costs. You might remember when you eliminated the sales tax on food and hygiene products that there was a hold harmless as part of that deal. This is eliminated in the introduced budget the way it's proposed, and Tyler will cover that a little more on the tax discussion. Here you've got reduced rates for teacher retirement, savings around closing correction facilities, and then some redirections of a few other things. I mentioned sales taxes down in K-12, which Tyler will also talk about, and I mentioned earlier the composite index, and then some savings around jail per diems and some jail closures. And then if there are no questions for me, I'm going to turn it over to Tyler, or if you think of more questions, I can also answer after Tyler's done with the resource tax discussion.
Okay. Turning to the caboose bill, so the introduced caboose bill, Senate Bill 29, includes $1.9 billion in additional general fund resources. A lot of that is coming from the revenue reforecast that occurred during the fall. You remember when you adopted the September budget, you used a very conservative outlook for the revenue forecast, and so this updates it with cash in the bank to date and then focusing on updating the economic inputs. You'll also see about a net of $511 million in addition to balances. These are the discretionary balances from the agency's appropriations that were unspent, and then there were some small reversions. And then you'll see a small increase in transfers. A lot of that is coming from the unused tax rebate fund. You issued all the tax rebates and there was excess money in that fund, so they're transferring it back to the general fund, and then ABC profits increased. So that 1.9, you then have the 7.3 million from the unappropriated balance in Chapter 1, and then Senate Bill 29 has a proposed net spending decrease of 392. A lot of that is technical related to K-12 the K-12 forecast and then the Medicaid forecast, which Wendy and Mike will talk about. And so that gets you to the carry forward balance of $2.4 billion from Senate Bill 29 that can go into Senate Bill 30, and that's a one-time resource that April mentioned. So then you turn to the Senate Bill 30, General Fund Resources. Here you see the beginning balance on that first line from Senate Bill 29. You have $2.4 billion. There's a small adjustments to balances. You have the base revenue, and then you have the general fund economic forecast adjustments, which total about $6 billion. And then you see on the next line after the forecast adjustments, the governor's proposed tax policy actions, which then are assumed in his revenue forecast. And we'll have a later slide that shows some of those are revenue producing, but some of those are revenue reducing. And so that gets you to a net $1 billion loss in revenues. And then there's the $805 million transfer from the Revenue Reserve Fund to the General Fund, and then there's about $2.2 billion in transfer adjustments. So that gets you to the total general fund resources available to about $62.9 billion. You then see the proposed spending totals about $4 billion, and then that gets you to the unappropriated balance in Senate Bill 30 as introduced as $8.7 million. Turning to slide 12, a little more detail on the revenue outlook. So the general fund revenue forecast assumes general fund revenue growth of about 3% in fiscal year 25 and 6% in fiscal year 26 before tax policy adjustments. The proposed policy changes that impact the general fund revenues are expected to decrease general fund revenues by about $1 billion over the biennium. And when you include that $1 billion reduction related to tax policy, general fund revenues are projected to increase 1.4% in fiscal year 25 and then 5.4% in fiscal year 26. In the table, I will note there's a line for post-GACR adjustments that reduced the GACR forecast by $150 million in the second year. That was based on legislative leaders' input and business leaders' input in the GACR forecast to note that the 26 forecast that the governor's administration had prepared seemed a little too optimistic, and so that's that reflection for those GACR adjustments. Now turning to the governor's assumed tax policy actions, like I've mentioned, it reduces revenue by a net $1 billion. But as I mentioned, there's two kinds of, there's revenue generating proposals and then there's revenue reducing proposals. So you'll see that the revenue generating proposals generate about $2.5 billion in general fund resources. This is from changes to the state sales and use tax, so include increasing the state sales and use tax rate by 90 basis points, expanding the base of sales tax to include digital personal property and taxable services. And then you'll see the governor's revenue reducing proposals total about $3.5 billion over the biennium, and that's largely coming from reduction of the individual tax rates by approximately 12% across all the brackets. And then you see there's a doubling of the dealer discount for the sales and use tax. This allows the sales and use tax, the businesses who are collecting sales and use to keep a portion of the sales and use tax, and then you see some adjustments to the earned income tax credit, the non-refundable portion, and then the education improvement scholarship tax credits. So I wanted to go a little more in detail on the sales tax proposals because those are the revenue generating ones. So the first portion is the 90 basis rate increase. So this would increase the general statewide sales and use tax from 4.3 to 5.2%. But as many of you know, there's regional taxes. And so when you look at the total tax rate on sales tax, it would be proposed at 7 to 8%, depending on the region of the state you're in. And so that's Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, and Central Virginia, the transportation money, the historic triangle, the tourism, and then if the locality has the local option school construction. Of the 90 basis point rate increase, there's no increase in the dedicated sales tax for K-12 or transportation. It's all going to the unrestricted general fund portion. The second portion of the sales tax proposal is expanding the tax base. So this would impose sales and use tax on digital personal property, digital downloads, and then taxable services, which are defined to include software services, website hosting and design, data storage, streaming services. The application of the sales and use tax on taxable services is exempt if the purchaser or consumer of the service is a business, so this is business-to-business transactions. And then the other note about the expansion is the additional revenue generated and dedicated to transportation is distributed half to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund and then half of it going to the Interstate 81 Improvement Fund until June 30th of 2031, or a total of $400 million has been deposited to the I-81 fund. Obviously, sales and use tax proposals have a K-12 impact. Like I mentioned, the 90 basis point increase does not impact K-12, but the expansion of the base does. And so you'll see in that top line, it increases K-12 sales tax by $54 million in fiscal year 25 and $139 million in 26 approximately. Because of how the K-12 formula works, there's a basic aid offset, and so the net actual increase to school divisions is $23.9 million in the first year and $61.9 million in the second year. Secondly, the governor proposed removing the supplemental payments in lieu of grocery tax. You'll remember when you exempted groceries from the state sales and use tax, the 1%, you backfilled the localities for the K-12 portion. That was $257.2 million in the fiscal year 24 base, and that's what you're seeing on that line. When you remove those, you also provide the basic aid offset. So when you lose $1 of sales tax, the state backfills on average 55 cents, and the localities on average across the Commonwealth have to pick up 45 cents. And so what you see, the net impact of the removing that supplemental payment is across the state, divisions have to now pay $115 million to support basic aid cost as calculated by the SOQ formula. And so when you net that number with the net impact of the sales tax policy changes from expanding the base, that is, school divisions are receiving in this proposed budget about $91 million less in the first year and then about $53 million in the second year. So they do not net out to be a zero increase. And I just wanted to leave you with slide number 16. So you'll remember in the last two General Assembly sessions, you've passed tremendous tax relief. And going forward, those tax policy actions are reducing your revenue for the biennial budget, Senate Bill 30, by $3 billion. So April talked about structural balance. Tax policy actions that you've already adopted are contributing to some of that imbalance between ongoing revenue and ongoing spending. And so now the governor's proposed additional tax policy actions, so it is kind of prioritizing what is the actions that you want to take to create a structural balance, not only for this biennium, but thinking about future biennia and where you're leaving the state in terms of revenue for spending. And Madam Chair, I will pause here for questions on resources and revenue.
Any questions? Any member of the committee have a question?
Madam Chair, I have one question.
Senator Servo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I could have swore when Secretary Cummings was here, say yesterday, he talked about the pass-through entity thing, which I haven't seen mentioned. My recollection was there was some big number associated with that, but I haven't seen any slides about that yet. Is that still a thing?
Yes. Pass-through, Madam Chair, Senator Servo, yes. Pass-through entity tax is something we're still monitoring. Based on the update yesterday, it seems like they feel confident that the refunds are coming in at the same rate as they expected, and so we're not expecting huge increases. But going forward, hopefully taxpayers continue to adjust their behavior so we're not over-collecting non-withholding twice. But that is based on taxpayer behavior, and if the taxpayers and their accountants figure out what their actual payments are going forward. And that was assumed in the Gaker forecast that over time people will start to correct them. So there is some conservatism built into the forecast related to non-withholding because of that. That is accounted for already.
Senator Favola.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make a comment, and perhaps you can respond. I think it's a really important point that for every dollar decrease in sort of tax revenue coming in, there's a like decrease in money available for public education. And the way we fund public education, of course, is through the composite index, and there's a state allocation and a local allocation. If the localities decide to not meet their obligation, in effect, there'll be less money for public education. If the state can't afford to meet the obligation because of the reduction in tax revenue, we're talking about reductions based off of our current service level. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, related to the sales tax proposal, for every dollar loss, that is basically the basic aid cost. So that is kind of the state's formula saying this is the basic cost to operate a school division. As you may know, and there's a range of debate, is the formula actually calculating it correctly. But the basic aid costs calculated by DOE are the basic aid cost that the state assumes responsibility for those costs along with the localities. As you know, localities go above and beyond the SOQ cost, and that was demonstrated based on the JLARC report.
Just a quick follow-up, Madam Chair. But you're making those assessments based on our current level of funding for K through 12. Is that a fair statement?
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, it's based on how the formula calculates those costs. And they did fund the SOQ cost as calculated by re-benchmarking in the budget.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just think it's an important point on how our public education system's funded.
Senator Boysko?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I wanted just to point out, I was the patron of the grocery and menstrual tax elimination, and it was always our intention that it would be backfilled, and that was the agreement that we made with the House and the Senate patrons. I will be carrying a budget amendment to provide that funding back into the budget, because I do believe that was not our intention to leave the schools and localities in a bad situation. So look forward to having that conversation.
Thank you. Other questions?
Madam Chair, I just wanted to make a comment quickly before we move on that structural balance is agnostic to whether you're reducing revenue or you're spending it. Structural balance, when we talk about it and as we think about the choices going forward, you can reduce revenues, but that's spending just like it would be if you were spending it on K-12 or public safety or somewhere else. Those are all choices. So I just wanted to make sure we made that clear. It's a little, it's maybe slightly less transparent because it comes off the front page when you reduce revenue, but that's spending. But spending in other areas of the state budget also contribute to structural imbalance. So as we discuss it and build the budget, I think those are things to keep in mind on both sides of that discussion. Thanks. I'll turn it over to Wendy. Sorry.
So starting with Senate Bill 29 in public education, this includes a net reduction of $282.6 million in general funds, and this is primarily driven by technical adjustments to enrollment and average daily membership, and then the updated sales tax revenues. And moving to Senate Bill 30, the introduced budget proposes net increases totaling $174 million general fund and $686 million non-general fund over the biennium. Just to highlight some of the major spending amendments, we have $412.1 million general fund over the biennium to support families in the child care subsidy program with state funding once federal funding becomes unavailable. There is $535 million non-general fund from the literary fund and $115 million general fund over the biennium in support of teacher retirement and unfunded liabilities. The reduction of $229 million due to the elimination of the supplemental general fund payment on sales tax on food. $60 million over the biennium for college partnership lab schools. $61 million over the biennium to support the expansion of the reading specialist staffing standard. $53 million in the first year to support a 1% bonus for instructional support positions, and then $122.8 million the second year to support a 2% raise for the same positions. And then the last thing to highlight on this slide is $40 million across the biennium for the Department of Education for state assessment contracts. And then, as we've kind of talked about on previous slides, the re-benchmarking costs for the biennium are about $969 million. And after removing one-time funds provided in the prior biennium, costs result in a net reduction of $204.6 million general fund. And this table is mostly for your reference, since a lot of these things were talked about on the previous slide, but just to highlight one more thing that was not on the previous slide, there's funding for Diploma Plus grants, and that's $40 million per year, and that's to support the attainment of industry-recognized credentials. And again, the table at the top is just more detail on some of the items already mentioned on the summary slide. But just to highlight one of the language amendments on early childhood, since that is such a large investment, there is language updating or establishing reporting requirements, waiting lists for mixed delivery, and then aligning some of the other requirements for mixed delivery with the child care subsidy program. And then these are some of the supplemental actions. These are all pretty small, so this table is mostly for your reference. And then we also wanted to highlight, again, in more detail in the Department of Education, some of these proposed amendments here. As I previously mentioned, there's $40 million for the new state assessment system, and then we also wanted to highlight the a small reduction in funds for the Office of School Quality to right-size that. And then the last thing here is just two small language amendments. In Secretary of Education, there's a report on teacher compensation, and then for the Department of Education, there's language to provide flexibility for child care staff-to-child ratios, which continues flexibility for the superintendent to change some of those ratios for those participating in the child care subsidy program. And I'll pause there in case there are any questions before passing it off to Wendy for higher education.
Before we move to the next presentation, would there be any questions of any member? Scott Searle? Sorry, Senator Searle?
Okay, Madam Chair. I thought I saw in the governor's press conference thing he put out that he reduced funding for the Virginia Preschool Initiative. Is that?
Yes, so that would be, and Wendy, feel free to jump in here. There was some, there was a reduction, Madam Chair, Senator Sherrill, to update for non-participation and recognize some savings there based on unused slots that were projected but then not filled. And so that's why there was a reduction in the introduced budget.
Madam Chair.
Senator Searle?
Just so I'm clear, does his budget just recapture money, or does it permanently reduce funding for jurisdictions like Fairfax County that don't take their full allocation?
So, Madam Chair, Senator Serval, it is a policy decision, but when they do rebenchmarking, they rebase everyone they remove the assumption of the non-participation back to zero, and then they make it as a policy decision. And this has been done for at least every budget that I've been here.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Questions by any other member of the committee before we move on to the next presentation? Thank you. Kendra?
Good morning. My name is Wendy Kong, and I'll cover the higher education and other education amendments that are proposed for the caboose as well as for the introduced budget. In SB 29, there is one additional payment for Virginia State University to provide the state match for their land grant status, and providing that also continues as well into the proposed budget. In the governor's introduced budget, there's 5 major investments that are provided that are more system-wide. The first one is the support of the Eastern Virginia Medical School merger with Old Dominion University. That was some legislation that was worked on in the last session. In addition, there's $16.6 million to support one-time campus safety and security, and that's also to partner with the Virginia Fusion Center, which is a partnership with the state police in terms of working with campus safety and security issues. There's $9.2 million to increase funding for the Workforce Credential Grant. This is sometimes referred to at the community colleges as the Fast Forward program, and this is for non-credit industry-based credentials. There's $7.8 million to establish community college regional career placement centers. They're looking to provide 9 regional centers across the state aligned with the Go Virginia regions. And there is a $6 million over the biennium for a statewide mental health contract, which will be available to public institutions to provide more of the telehealth. This table is more for a reference. It covers many of the things that I just mentioned, as well as some additional items that are more institution-specific. I do want to also note the Virtual Library Consortium. This is with the public and private institutions to help reduce costs and provide online support for libraries at the colleges. There's some additional money that's provided there. Moving on to this next slide, this is more the savings and reductions. April covered a few of these, but we'll note the removal of the Pell Initiative funding in the second year. This is to help support access and completion for low-income students. The Online Virginia Network and New College Institute, as well as the Loan Ombudsman, these ones have asterisks next to them because there is some code language that currently establishes them in code. There's some other reductions that are provided as well. Some of these are more alignment to demand or some areas that weren't used. Moving on to some transfers of funding. In the Innovative Partnership, this was something that was provided in the last budget, and April had mentioned earlier, these monies are provided more in the first year, and then the money of $1 million in the second year is designated as one time. There will still be money in the base of that program of $2 million per year, but this is a shift of the money to the first year. Kendra will cover a few things in the other areas of higher education, the Virginia Biotechnology, Life Sciences, and Pharmaceutical Manufacturing. The governor mentioned this is the Virginia Research Triangle. There's $100 million that's provided to institutions there. And in other education, we really didn't have any actions. There's some NGF adjustments to the Virginia Museum of Natural History. I'll quickly cover two language amendments. The maintain affordable access. During the last September budget that we passed, there was an additional $75 million that was provided to institutions for base operational support. This language was then added to the funding amount that was provided and requires the Secretary of Education and SHEV to establish performance measures, and also authorizes the Secretary in the second year to determine the funding allocations and contingent upon institutions not raising tuition higher than 2.5% or inflation, and that they also need to submit a performance plan. One other language amendment I want to point out is the tuition assistance grant. There's a proposal to increase that amount for the online students from 50% of the campus-based award to 75%. That's moving the award from $2,250 to $3,750. And then also is asking SHEV to work on a way to provide an online system for that. In addition, there's a few alignments to the FAFSA. You may have heard in the news regarding the FAFSA changes that have been happening nationally. There's some alignment that we have in budget language to align that with state aid, and there's some technical adjustments that are taking place there. With that, I will pause and answer any questions regarding higher education.
Any member of the committee have a question? Staff? Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Continue.
Madam Chair, I'm Mike Tweedy, so I will take you through Health and Human Resources. So looking at the Senate Bill 29, the caboose bill, it includes a net reduction of about $85.3 million for the Secretariat. A lot of that is the forecast that you'll see Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance programs. This is sort of like the tail end of the effects of the pandemic, the enhanced federal funding, as well as some lower managed care rates. You'll see as we talk about the Senate Bill 30, where Medicaid is actually returning to normal and the costs that have to be fully funded there. The Children's Services Act also, I'll talk about that here shortly when we get to Senate Bill 30. And the health care fund as well. Just to note here, you'll see that there is a reduction of $10 million for permanent supportive housing. If you recall, in September, $30 million was added to it. This is a recognition that they can't spend all $30 million of that in this fiscal year. But in the base budget going forward, the full $30 million per year is there. Moving to just an overview of Health and Human Resources in Senate Bill 30. So as I go through this, I'll touch on these, but you can actually see that the introduced budget proposes a net general fund increase of about $1.7 billion for this area. And of course, the largest portion of that is Medicaid. So you can see for DMAS, the variety of forecasts. So the Medicaid forecast itself was $714 million, but you also have to add the health care fund to that as well, which is the additional $508 million. That gets you to the $1.2 billion. So the healthcare fund is where tobacco taxes and other revenues are dedicated to actually support the state match for Medicaid. And during the pandemic, just because of the nature of it and impacting healthcare utilization, it actually came to be dependent on repayments to the managed care companies. And so those repayments are really coming to an end because all the rates and everything have sort of returned to normal. But essentially, this is the recognition for the forecast that the enhanced federal match ended in this, basically just this December 31st. And so this is the state having to pay its full share of the program. The introduced budget also adds 3,440 developmental disability waiver slots. So technically, this number is based on the priority one wait list as of November 1st. So it effectively, that was the goal, to kind of eliminate at that point. But just remember that the wait list grows essentially every day, every week, every month. And just to note, the two children's health insurance programs, you'll see growth there as well. In some cases, like for the FAMOUS program, that's people who were kids that were on Medicaid, but because their family income is higher now, they've just moved to FAMOUS. That's all part of the return to normal for Medicaid, and actually everyone having to check their renewal once every year. The only other savings thing I'll note here is that there was about $8.9 million in savings to restrict Medicaid coverage for weight loss drugs. It doesn't eliminate it, it just adds additional restrictions. Moving to community behavioral health, which is the other major area, in recent years, a lot of money has been put toward this. There's about $89 million for community behavioral health in here. So there's additional crisis services. Remember, in the September Chapter 1 budget, additional $58 million was provided for crisis services. So this adds an additional $33 million the first year and then $2.6 million. So this is continuing to help develop out crisis receiving centers and crisis stabilization units and provide alternatives, essentially, to basically people just showing up in the ER. You can also see funding $10 million for funding psychiatric emergency rooms, $10 million for mobile crisis units. Again, this is all sort of supplementing what was proposed and funded in Chapter 1 as well. And then you can see some of the other ones. There's a variety of other initiatives to continue to support those. But certainly if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. In the behavioral health facilities, the largest increase here is basically sort of kind of increase in the salaries, looking at market compensation for both clinical roles and then food and environmental services staff. So you can say that's about $40 million over the biennium to make those adjustments, and some other minor things to really help with the workforce issues within the behavioral health facilities.
Could we suspend for a moment? I think Senator McPike has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Back on slide 36, providing one-time funding for mobile crisis units. Are there one-time costs associated with this as continuing staffing of the mobile crisis units?
Madam Chair, Senator McPike, so that's kind of been one of the issues. Last year they had proposed one-time money. If you recall, there was also the bill passed to basically direct that commercial insurance cover mobile crisis. So in an effort to find other revenue sources for it. So Medicaid covers mobile crisis, so that's one of the revenue sources. So the idea really is sort of the one-time cost to sort of set it up, give it some early operating costs as well, and then hopefully they get to a point where they can receive enough Medicaid and other revenue to support them. It's a question whether that'll happen, but that's certainly been one of the questions that we've been asking.
Any further questions before staff continues on? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On this slide 38, so this is just other things in DBHGS. I won't really go over it as parts of the early intervention services. It's the normal increase as it grows over time, the $2.5 million per year. There are some savings items in here, but this is really all, for the most part, using other non-general fund services or sources, as well as just some programs that weren't spending to where they were. So it's actually no reductions in services. In Department of Social Services, the largest issue here is the relative maintenance payment program, which actually started during the pandemic with TANA funds. It essentially provides almost like foster care maintenance payments, but this is to relatives. So it's, again, this is all part of efforts in recent years to fund alternatives to foster care, looking at relatives and kinship to do this. And so there are also bills pending in the General Assembly that you all will see that sort of, again, try to deal with this issue. There's also most of the rest of this that I'll note is there's an increase in their income verification contract, the TANF block grant shortfall. So essentially, we've kind of reached the point where TANF has basically the cash balances have been drawn down. And so the only thing that really happens in the budget, no programs are really adversely affected. It's for the most part, they're just replaced with general funds. So they didn't necessarily cut any of them back. I will note, too, the other thing, too, is this, the introduced budget does fund the summer EBT program for children. So this was a new program started during the pandemic that Congress actually last December made permanent. So it provides an additional, basically almost a SNAP benefit during the summer months for children. This slide just has a few other things for social services. I will note you see the savings of $5 million per year in the prevention services funding for foster care. Madam Chair, I think Senator Favola has a question.
I think Senator Favola has a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On the TANF block grant shortfall, those were the categories, sort of 2 and 3, the things that we were funding with TANF that supported the category of TANF TANF beneficiaries. They were not direct payments to the TANF beneficiaries. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, that is correct. These are the discretionary grants, not the mandated benefits.
Thank you.
Then moving to the Department of Health, to note here again, there is some TANF in here, so you'll see that's the largest thing there is supplying that money for things like the contraception and the LARC program. You can see, but again, they're not affected. They're just switching them from TANF to general funds. 2 of the loan repayment programs for, one for behavioral health and then the nursing education acceleration programs. There's some workforce funding in there as well, and matching funds for the drinking water, which that brings down a significant amount of federal funds as well. I will note, just the other thing I'll note for the Department of Health, you'll see the $1.8 million per year for the agency's financial oversight. That kind of goes into line with a Part 3 transfer where money was being taken from the motor vehicle registration revenue that the Office of EMS gets during the Great Recession. That was increased to redirect $12.5 million per year to the general fund. It's a budget savings. In both SB 29 and 30, $12.5 million of that over 2 years is redirected to stay with the Office of EMS to support their obligations. You may have heard in the news that there have been a lot of financial irregularities within that office that they're continuing to try to understand the implications of that. So essentially that funding is to help shore up their obligations over that 2-year period. Just to note, and the only other thing I'll note for other HHR agencies is the Children's Services Act. You can see the $48.5 million per year. This program basically actually had generated some savings during the pandemic as the number of people who qualify for it had sort of declined for different reasons. But you can see it is actually growing again. And a large portion of this is actually the private day special education, which is an issue that the General Assembly has been dealing with for a number of years. So, Madam Chair, I'll pause if there are any questions for Health and Human Resources.
Questions of any member of the committee? You can continue on. Thank you.
So moving to public safety and veterans, the governor's budget proposes about $2 million net increase for public safety and homeland security agencies, and then about a $35 million general fund net increase for veterans and defense affairs agencies. Just highlighting a few items on all these slides. So the public safety subcommittee this morning just heard a lot about the transition from Lawrenceville to state management. This is the state's currently only privately operated operation, and they're going to bring the facility over to state management beginning of August of next year. A lot of these costs that you're seeing is because their staffing ratio that they're using for the contract are just much lower than what they've been using for Department of Corrections state facilities, and so it's to increase that staffing level. The only other thing I'll note on this slide, unless there are questions, are the savings from 4 facility closures. You'll see at the bottom it's about $120 million over the biennium. So what's going on is that, as you all know, the inmate population has declined, and there's also been significant staffing shortages. So the department identified several facilities that really just weren't keeping their staffing up. That's obviously a safety issue. Some of them have already moved inmates over to other facilities to address that. But the 4 closures are effective June 30th of this year. And so this is mostly the savings from those reductions in operations, plus some offsetting costs. They have to pay to mothball it, basically keep it sustained and the building usable for the future, and then also pay some severance for employees that aren't able to find employment elsewhere in the system. Moving over to the next slide, so slide 46. I'll just highlight a couple. The first one is the Law Enforcement Recruitment and Wellness Program. This is $18 million in one-time funds, primarily going to be used for sign-on and recruitment bonuses, so a local agency could apply to use some of these funds for that purpose. It's supposed to be targeted to out-of-state folks, so there's a bar on the funds going from someone transferring, say, between Chesterfield and Henrico or something like that. It would have to be people coming into the state. And then there's about $3 million for wellness initiatives as part of this proposed initiative. I'll also highlight the sworn officer pay step increase for state police. As you'll remember, in 2022, the General Assembly provided significant funding to establish a pay scale for the state police. This is essentially to move everyone up one step on the pay scale, which is 1.4%. And that's the $3 million in each year. These are just a few for your reference for other public safety agencies. And unless there's any questions on this slide, I'll move to Veterans and Defense Affairs. The largest item here is $30.5 million general fund and one-time funds that can be used over multiple years. Currently, the state has 2 veterans care centers. These are nursing home assisted living that are obviously only used for veterans. We have 2 now and 2 more opening. One opened in November, one's going to open next summer. And this is to shore up their operations until their number of residents can pick up and their number of revenue coming from Medicaid and other insurance funds their operation. So that's what that $30.5 million is. That really covers it for public safety and veterans. I'm happy to take any questions.
Senator Serval.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to go back to the savings you said we were achieving from reductions in jail population, prison populations. I think you said it's, what was it, 15? Okay, so it's about between 50 and 60 million a year going forward, right?
Correct.
And I believe yesterday in our general government briefing, you said we're also saving about 15 million a year in jail per diems, right?
That's right. Madam Chair, Senator Serval, we'll talk about this on a future slide, but this is, as you said, the state portion. These are the state facilities. Once we get to the compensation board, you're going to see $15 million each year for inmate per diems that are projected to go down because of lower forecast, as well as there's 2 jail closures, Bristol City Jail, Hampton Roads Regional, and there's additional, I want to say about 15 million, but I'll look at it when we get there. And a reduction, the state isn't going to be making those payments for those personnel anymore. So yes, that is correct.
Yes. Madam Chair, just really quick.
Senator Serval.
So we're now saving $75 million a year because of reduced jail populations going forward into the future, it appears now, right? Collectively because of the reduced jail population.
Madam Chair, Senator Serval, yes, based on the inmate population projection,
It's a
that
big
is what's
success to
projected.
talk about. Thank you. Thank you.
Any further questions before we move on to Commerce and Trade?
Good morning. I'm Kendra Shiflett, and I'll be covering Commerce and Trade and Economic Development this morning. Just a general overview, the introduced budget proposes a net increases totaling $109 million general fund over the biennium for Commerce and Trade, and then I'll go on to some of the major spending items on the next slide. Just to touch on a few of the items, there's an additional funding of $91 million over the biennium, for the Business Ready Sites program. There's also an additional $25 million for the Business Ready Sites acquisition program. In the Department of Housing and Community Development, you will notice a fairly significant reduction for the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, and that will eliminate state support for the broadband expansion. The idea is that we are receiving over $1 billion in federal funding for the BEAD program, and so hopefully that money will have enough flexibility to do what needs to be done, but we're still waiting for final guidelines on how that program will be implemented and negotiated between the state and the federal government. Also in the Department of Housing and Community Development, there's $25 million to establish an early learning center capital incentive program to provide grants for higher education facilities to work in localities that are underserved by child care. And then further down the page, at the bottom of the page, there's the $100 million in the Virginia Investment Partnership Authority that is going to work with the biotech, life sciences, and pharmaceutical manufacturing network that Wendy touched on.
Madam Chair.
Senator Morrison, I didn't see your name in queue, but I do see Senator Borsco, so I'm going to let her go first. She plugged in. Senator Borsco.
Madam Chair, just a comment.
Yes, I see your name on the screen.
Yes,
Go right
ma'am.
ahead.
So we talked about, you just mentioned about eliminating the VADI grants. I would just like to point out to everyone that all of the locations that have active VADI grants ongoing will not be eligible to participate in the federal funding through the BEAD grant. There are still significant challenges with Make Ready and finishing those. So I and Senator Marsden will be working, I bet he was going to talk about the same thing, that we will be working to make sure that we're securing some funding to finish those projects before we eliminate the VADI grants, because we don't want to leave anybody unserved in Virginia. That's been our priority, and just wanted to clarify.
Thank you, Senator Borsco. Now, Senator Marsden, I see your name in queue.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. The $10 million for the inland port in the Mount Rogers, is that for site acquisition, or have they determined the site yet? What?
So you may recall, Senator Marsden, Madam Chair, that there was $10 million provided in the budget that was just passed in September for the first stage of this project. They're still working on that. That money hasn't been drawn down or used yet. This is an additional $10 million to continue on to the next stage. So they're still working on site acquisition, and then they'll move on to preliminary design for the project. At the time that the initial $10 million was funded, the overall cost of the project was estimated at about $55 million. But there are no final details on that at this point.
Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Moving on now to the Secretary of Labor. Within the Labor Secretariat, you'll see there are a number of actions which are moving programs to the newly established Department of what are we calling it? Department of Workforce Development and Advancement. And there is an additional $3.2 million in the first year to fund some of those transitional costs and to finish that transition. There's also $2 million each year to develop a registered apprenticeship grant program for businesses, and that would provide a financial incentive to businesses to participate in the state's registered apprenticeship program. And there's $1 million proposed to establish a healthcare workforce training program to connect job seekers in southeastern Virginia with healthcare skills training and supportive services in Hampton Roads. A couple of language items that I wanted to note. There's a recommendation for a $30 million line of credit for the Virginia Employment Commission to use during times of sudden economic downturns for operating cost, kind of in advance of the money coming in from the federal government. And there's also language which would authorize the Virginia Employment Commission to promulgate a fee schedule to cover some of their administrative expenses. The language directs that the fees are to remain cost neutral for businesses, so they would have to work out with the federal government how that will offset against the unemployment insurance trust fund payments that are going in.
Question.
I have two names in queue, and it appears that Senator Favola, you came in first, and then Senator Eben.
The $30 million line of credit, Is that going to help with upgrading computers and some of the elements that are necessary for good service? I mean, I've had constituents waiting for months to even get an answer on requests that they have submitted to our Unemployment Commission. So,
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, the idea is that money will only be used if there's a case of a sudden economic downturn and they have to do a sudden staff up to meet that. So the ongoing need for system upgrades and those type of expenses, I believe, is more intended to come out of the fee schedule for administrative cost.
Madam Chair, just to follow up.
Senator Favola, you may continue.
I thought last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, we did put money in for some system upgrades, and I'm wondering if we in fact actually did implement those.
Madam Chair, Senator Favola, yes, they have been doing upgrades and making system improvements, and particularly with their call center operations, they've highly enhanced that, and they're moving through those calls much quicker now. They do have still a backlog with the processing of some of the pandemic-related items, but I believe the intent is to have that finished out by June of this year.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Ebbett?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question for Kendra. To follow on what Senator Favola was asking about, I had sent a letter to the conferees last year asking for more money for the VEC to deal with the backlog, and I'm wondering, in the introduced budget, has the governor increased their funding over the last budget?
Madam Chair, Senator Ebbin, there's no increase for the Virginia Employment Commission. They are still operating to some degree with the appeals ramped up a little bit and finishing out some of the money that they had received in Chapter 1. So yes, there.
Okay, I would just, Madam Chair, if I could note for members of the subcommittee dealing with that there are thousands of Virginians who are waiting on their appeals to be heard, and that the VEC could benefit from additional staffing, improved staffing levels, and perhaps some of the upgrades that Senator Favola described if they haven't all been made yet. Thank you.
Senator Favola, do you have another question? Your name's still in queue. Thank you. Kendra?
Thank you. Moving on now to the Secretariat of Agriculture and Forestry. The biennial budget proposes a net increases totaling $6 million for agriculture and forestry. There's $2 million included for agricultural technology research projects and $1.3 million for removal of derelict fire towers at the Department of Forestry. There's also in agriculture and forestry a $1.1 million general fund budget reduction, and those are budget savings strategies dealing with reductions in the Farmland Preservation Program and reductions in support for international trade. And there's also less funding going to be provided for the Department of Forestry internet connectivity upgrades at their field offices. If there are no questions, I'll move on to the Secretary of Natural Resources. This slide provides an overview, and then I'll touch on some items on the next more detailed slide. In natural resources, as April mentioned earlier, there is about $138 million provided for a discretionary deposit to the Water Quality Improvement Fund. And there's an additional $60 million in non-general fund appropriated for that, and that is associated with settlement funding that's coming into the state. There is $100 million proposed for the Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund that provides funding for flood preparedness at the community level, and then there's $73.9 million provided to support the Norfolk Coastal Storm Risk Management Plan. There's also $50 million provided for the Richmond Combined Sewer Overflow Project and $35 million to fund the Bristol landfill remediation. There is also within the Department of Housing or Department of Historic Resources, there's a proposed capital grant program for the 250th anniversary of the Revolution of $35 million.
Madam Chair.
I have Senator McPike, I saw you in queue. Did you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Real quick, on the $35 million, they're using general funds or capital outlay. How are they approaching that issue, and are there subcategories provided in that budget line item?
Madam Chair, Senator McPike, they are using general fund money for that grant program, and there are not the criteria are not set out yet, but the department would be developing the criteria for awarding the grants. So they would be competitive grants.
Thank you. Senator Eben, do you have a question?
I do, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the Richmond CSO funding and ask if it's possible to get information on the three areas, Lynchburg, Richmond, and Alexandria, in terms of how much the state has contributed, both as a dollar amount, but as a percentage of their anticipated total cost for remediation for those three areas.
Madam Chair, Senator Evan, I don't have it in front of me today, but I would certainly be happy to get that for you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if there are no additional questions, I'll move on now to transportation.
Thank you.
The introduced budget proposes net increases in the of $92.2 million going in general fund support for transportation, and then a net decrease of $612 million in the Transportation Trust Fund non-general fund appropriation. The general fund spending includes $70 million for improvements to I-81 in the Christiansburg area and $20 million for a deposit to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund. There's language requiring the Secretary of Transportation and the Department of Rail and Public Transportation to approve any increased funding for WMATA in excess of the maximum 3% cap on increases that's established in the code. And the language requires the WMATA folks to develop a corrective action plan to address their cost reductions and other strategies before that increase would be approved. There's also proposed capital outlay projects, including $485 million in a non-general fund appropriation for Port Authority projects. Are there any questions in transportation?
Seeing none.
Thank you.
Next, moving to general government, and just to note that Katie covers judicial and the compensation board, so we'll go back and forth as we go through this very quickly.
Sure.
Looking in Senate Bill 29 and the caboose bill, essentially there are some savings actions there. One is just the largest one to recognize debt service savings. The two related to jails, that savings continues into the SB 30, and Katie will address that when she talks about that. The only other thing to note for general government in the caboose bill is the central accounts, the American Rescue, all of the ARPA funds under that are technically allocated, but they did reallocate $39 million of that to the child care subsidy program. And then when you get into Senate Bill 30, they actually have language that says that on June 30th of this fiscal year, if there's anything unobligated in any of the other allocations, it would actually all be reverted and go to the child care subsidy program. But there's no estimate of what would be unobligated. So in SB 30 for general government, the net increase is about $492 million, and you'll see that much of that is in compensation. So this is just the highlights that I'll touch as we move through it. This next slide is employee compensation. So this chart covers everything that's in the bill. So it's the teacher salary increases are funded out of the Department of Education, but this just kind of summarizes the total actions. There's a 1% bonus in each year for state and state-supported local employees, as well as in the second year, 1% salary increase. And then, of course, teachers have the 1% bonus in the first year, and then the 2% salary increase in the second year. And there are targeted salary adjustments. Earlier, I talked about the behavioral health piece as well, and you can see in other areas as well for state police, DOC and MRC. For judicial, I'll let Katie cover that real quick.
Okay.
I'll be brief since there isn't much in Judicial Department. The one thing I'll highlight is the Court of Appeals. This is 14 more positions for the Court of Appeals, both attorneys and supporting staff, to handle an increase in caseload and an increase in the complexity of caseload. Part of this is due to legislation passed a few years ago, but there's also other factors that are leading to that increase. And with that, I'll hand it back to Mike for the next item.
In the executive offices, the largest increase here is $4.6 million. The Office of the Governor, so this is related to the Permitting Enhancement Evaluation Platform.
Yes.
That platform is something that DEQ created for basically to create transparency in permitting. And so the purpose of this funds is to expand it to other agencies that are involved in permitting processes. And the only other thing to note, there's a lot of smaller items in the executive offices, is about 13 positions across the Office of the Attorney General to deal with consumer protection, IT, and ratepayer protection that's included. And next, I'll turn it to Katie for the Compensation Board.
So we briefly talked about the jail closures. You can see the $30 million between the inmate per diems and the 2 jails that are closing. The only other savings that I'll highlight is this vacant positions in constitutional officer offices. This is specific to 3 offices, so circuit court clerks, commonwealth attorneys, and sheriffs. And essentially what it's doing is it's projecting the amount that isn't going to be needed due to vacant positions that therefore wouldn't be reimbursed by the compensation board. And it's in the first year, it's putting that projected unneeded funds in a fund, and then in the future, that fund will serve any reductions in vacancies. So that's what you're seeing. The second year is they'll capture some money in the first year, put it in a fund, but then in the out years, the appropriation is reduced by $9.4 million.
Senator Locke has a question.
Actually, it should go back to slide 66. I'm trying to clarify what it means by move diversity, equity, and inclusion funding.
Yes, Madam Chair, Senator Locke. So when that office was created by statute, basically, the way the budget works is by items, and each item is a program, so you kind of separate out things to track it. So this office actually had its own program. So in the governor's proposed budget, he's actually getting rid of that program and moving it all into just his general program. And he put in language to earmark about $1.3 million of it for this office. But to note, there was actually $1.8 million allocated for that. So essentially what that means is by moving it all and just mixing it together with his stuff, he's freed up about almost $500,000 for other uses. So there's a couple pieces to that, but that's essentially what it does. It just kind of like consolidates the budget into one, and then he actually redirects some of it to just his general office budget and operations.
I don't think Senator Locke's done with that question, but.
It's not a quick, is it?
Okay. So moving to, thank you, Madam Chair. So moving on to other things in administration, slide 68. I won't talk about much here because a lot of the stuff that occurs in administration, these other agencies, is basically where they charge agencies for services, and it's a lot of non-general fund actions. So there are some savings actions here, but it's really just using non-general fund resources to supplant general funds. In finance, you'll see the largest increase is really as interest costs are higher, the issuance of bonds, that debt service payments go up about $83 million to cover those increased costs. And there's a few other minor savings things to reduce the operational budgets for some of the finance agencies. Then moving to central appropriations. So this is where items are accounted for, where they affect multiple agencies. So you can see the largest increase is the increase for the state salary and bonus is about $168 million. The other largest item is $150 million is put in for this state agency IT infrastructure fund. So it'd be $150 million that is put in this fund that agencies could basically apply to get money from, and the Secretary of Administration and Finance would basically approve the allocation of any of those funds. There's an increase in the health insurance premium plan. So this is basically the state agency, the state cost of that about $106 million. There's then $20 million to support the American Revolution 250 Commission. Remember, Kendra mentioned in Historic Resources, there's $35 million for a capital program for this. That is unrelated to what the commission has asked for. This $20 million is related to the commission's ask. And then there's $15 million for this workforce recruitment program, which is a program that at VEDP to do marketing of in-demand jobs and that sort of thing. So you'll see the last few of these, and going to the next slide, most of these are basically central actions where like costs go up or down to operate the various internal service funds for a whole host of services across state agencies, and those just get reflected here. And then just to note on the last slide for central appropriations, I mentioned the language about the ARPA funds, and then there's other non-general fund changes as well for the tobacco money. And then lastly, in general government or the independent agencies, which most of those actions before, which I won't go into detail, are just the non-general fund changes, whether it's for operational cost or other things that they need in GF, because they're basically self-funded. But within the State Corporation Commission, the Bureau of Insurance, the health reinsurance program, so this basically started this past year. This is where basically with the federal waiver, the state actually subsidizes the claims in the individual market and reduces premiums for people in that market by as much as 15 to 20% or so. So you can see that this is the additional state funds, the $5 million or the $52 million over the biennium to basically fully fund the state share. I'll just bring to your attention the next line down where you see there's $686 million. That's the federal share of that program. So you can see that there's a significant federal investment in that program with only the smaller state investment. So with that, Madam Chair, if there are any questions, that concludes general government.
Any member of the committee have any questions of staff? Thank you.
Madam Chair, turning to capital outlays, so the governor's proposed budget includes a $2.1 billion capital program. He proposes $1.2 billion as either general fund or general fund tax-supported debt. And you'll remember that tax-supported debt reduces your debt capacity for additional debt that you can bond. Senate Bill 29 has 3 projects. One is a reversion project of unused funding, an increase for non-general funds for Department of Forestry, and then conversion of a Virginia State project from a pool project to just a standalone project. Looking at the capital outlay program in a little more detail, about 2/3 of the program that's general fund supported is focused on deferred maintenance, improvements to existing facilities, or maintenance reserve. There's $300 million in general fund support to supplement previously authorized projects for cost overruns. There's $404 million for the maintenance reserve program, but as we've mentioned earlier, it's only in the first year only and doesn't spread the cost over the 2 years of the budget. You'll see there's large investments and improvements and renovations. There's equipment for projects coming online. There's additional equipment related to the Amazon Tech Talent Program. And then there's significant deferred maintenance type projects. What I will note is you'll notice there's very limited new construction, and the new construction is limited to a 9C bond project at Virginia State for student housing, and then an indoor small arms firing range at the State Military Reservation, which is funded from funds from the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project lease that's coming. The landing is at the State Military Reservation. Slide number 77 kind of just shows some of the deferred maintenance and improvement projects. You'll see a lot of them are umbrella projects at the higher ed, and then you'll see specific standalone projects or funds that are also similar in type for deferred maintenance. Slide 78, you'll see the proposed construction pools. You'll notice a lot of the construction pools are related to also improvements or deferred maintenance type projects, and as many of your budget amendments reflected, there are ask from the higher ed institutions for actual new construction or renovations of existing facilities that are that you've introduced as member amendments. Slide 79, you'll see the planning pool and the pool supplements. And then slide 80 are some of the capital funding language changes. The one I will point out that most of you will hear about is the Tier 3 higher ed institutions. And the governor's budget, there's a proposal that they are going to be required to cover 25% of the cost of new capital construction projects that support E&G programs. And so this is a policy change applicable to the Tier 3 institutions. And then you'll see some additional capital outlay funding framework that they're proposing and some changes to the authorities provided to the 6-year capital plan advisory committee. Madam Chair, that completes capital outlay. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Seeing none? Turn it back over to our director. Senator Locke.
I don't have a question about capital outlay, but I do have a question going back to.
Put your mic on.
I'm sorry. I don't have a question about capital outlay, but I do have a question going back to slide 23 on K-12.
Okay.
It has to do with right size the Office of School Quality. And that funding is being removed?
Correct. This is not to eliminate the office entirely, Madam Chair, Senator Locke. This is not to eliminate the office entirely. This is a reduction in it. And in the introduced budget, it was to align with the current staffing levels that they have. This was additional funding that was added last biennium with the prior administration in terms of increasing that office capacity to support schools that needed to meet accreditation standards. And this is, again, the introduced budget was to align with the current staffing levels that they have.
Madam Chair, Senator Locke, I will note that the Office of School Quality funding was supposed to be phased in over time. So that was based on the JLARC recommendation when they studied the department.
To phase out the office?
No, to phase up the office.
Okay.
And so what you funded was only a portion of the phase, and we would have to get back what is additionally needed based on the JLARC recommendation.
Okay.
Okay, so the Office of School Quality is designed to assist divisions and personnel in terms of their accreditation and their programs, correct?
Madam Chair and Senator Locke, yes, that is correct.
But we are right sizing. I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
Senator Locke.
But we're now right sizing the office that's designed to assist.
That's what the governor's proposing.
That is, again, what the governor's proposed to do. Yes.
Okay.
Senator Locke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just trying to eliminate my confusion on that. Thank you, Madam.
Senator Hashmi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm sorry, if we could return to page 30, just wanted some clarification on the higher education, the repurposing of funding that's authorized. Do we have a timeline of when Secretary of Education and Chev will establish these performance standards? And then my real question is, are those performance standards then going to be used by the Secretary of Education to determine the funding allocations in the second year? Are those two connected, those two items?
Madam Chair, Senator Hashmi, yes. And there are some timelines in there, and I'd have to get back to you on what those are, but they do specify when the institutions do need to provide their plan to meet those performance standards, and then as well as providing an update on when they would provide those. In regard to your second question regarding how these two align, yes, once those are set, then they do need to update their plans in order to be able to receive the funding in the second year.
Any further questions? Turn it back over to our Executive Director.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I did just want to reiterate the point about structural balance, and that there are so many, if you go back early in the presentation, so many one-time resources that are being used in this budget, and thinking about sort of the long term. It's not going to be easy to sort of unwind or build this budget. I will also just mention that the reason so many bills come here from standing committees is to actually accurately account for the cost of those bills in the budget. That's a priority and something that needs to be done because, Virginia is required to have a balanced budget. But every bill that's passed, we're going to have to find funding to do that too. So it's just something I'm going to mention because it's going to be more difficult than it has been in a number of years to account for those costs from legislation or to build this budget. And the other thing, Madam Chair, that I wanted to mention is if this wasn't enough detail for you, and I'm sure I'm going to say that laughingly, the staff does produce a summary of the governor's introduced budget. It's kind of booklet size. It's posted on our website, and it's sort of fallen out of favor for members to want a hard copy. But if you would like a hard copy of that budget summary, please let me know, and we'll have one printed for you. And that concludes my comments, Madam Chair, and the agenda, I believe, for the day.
Thank you, but I think, Senator McPike, you're in queue, so you have another question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Is more just to thank the staff for this. I think it highlights the structural imbalances that we as a committee have to figure out very early to understand the use of one-time funds, the rebalancing of revenue, as opposed to where they spread expenditures, and many in doing so in an imbalanced way. And so it really is a holistic restart of a budget process, and to understand which bills we need to pass, we've got to have some very early structural questions first.
Absolutely.
And fast, and that's a lot of work.
Absolutely.
And thanks staff for their hard work to break this down for us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If there are no further questions, staff has at this point no further presentations. Seeing no other business, the committee shall rise.
Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.